Between 1965 and 1973, over 2 million young American men were drafted to fight in Vietnam.
Get down! Good God, y'all!
Some of them were already R&B stars. Some were about to become R&B stars. Some had brothers, friends, and bandmates who went instead of them.
Boys head, when will it end?
And every single story you're about to hear is real, verified, and largely forgotten. How the draft built careers, ended them, delayed them, and inspired some of the greatest soul records ever made. Let's get into it. Number 10, Archie Bell and the Drells, Tighten Up, 1968. This is the most direct and most dramatic story in this entire list. An artist who was actually drafted, actually sent to Vietnam, actually wounded in combat, and whose biggest hit went to number 1 while he was recovering in a Veterans Administration hospital bed.
Come on, babe. Yeah.
Archie Bell, lead singer of the Houston-based group Archie Bell and the Drells, was drafted into the United States Army on May 12, 1967, according to multiple verified historical accounts.
I said, if you can do it now. I said,
Before he left for service, Bell and his bandmate Billy Butler had already recorded a demo of a song called Tighten Up back in 1964, an upbeat, danceable, instrumental and vocal showcase that had been sitting largely unreleased and unnoticed for years. After Bell was drafted, the demo was eventually picked up and properly released. And then, in one of the more remarkable coincidences in music history, while Archie Bell was serving in Vietnam, Tighten Up started climbing the charts back home without him.
don't get too tight. Come on, let's tighten it up now.
The song reflected a perspective of genuine reluctance toward the draft and the war that the group expressed in other recordings of the era, including a song called A Soldier's Prayer 1967, which captured the anxiety of a generation of young black men receiving draft notices with no enthusiasm for the fight ahead of them, a sentiment that, in Bell's case, turned out to be tragically well-founded.
Oh, yeah. Tighten up now. Come on, Bill.
Archie Bell was wounded during his tour of duty in Vietnam. While he was recovering in a Veterans Administration hospital back in the United States, Tighten Up reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on April 13th, 1968.
Tighten up now. Oh, yeah. Everybody tighten up now.
Think about that timeline for a moment. A soldier, wounded in combat, lying in a VA hospital bed, learns that his song has become the number 1 record in the entire country.
Tighten up now. Come on.
He wasn't on tour promoting it. He wasn't doing interviews. He wasn't even fully aware in real time of how massive the song was becoming, because he was recovering from injuries sustained fighting in a war that the song itself, in spirit, had quietly pushed back against. It remains one of the most extraordinary, almost unbelievable true stories in the entire history of American popular music. Number 9, Marvin Gaye, What's Happening, Brother, 1971.
I'm just getting back what you knew I would.
Frankie Gaye, Marvin Gaye's younger brother, answered his draft notice at 25 years old and served during the Vietnam War as an Army radio disc jockey.
Together again.
For 3 years, while stationed overseas, Frankie wrote letters home to his older brother Marvin, detailed emotional letters describing what he was witnessing, the violence, the death, the disillusionment, the gap between what Vietnam veterans were experiencing and what civilians back home understood about the war.
I no job, my friend. Money.
When Frankie returned to civilian life in Washington, D.C. in 1970, the conversations between the two brothers continued in person. And according to Frankie's own 2003 memoir, Marvin Gaye, My Brother, some of those conversations left both men in tears. Marvin Gaye had already been moving toward more socially conscious material. He'd been deeply shaken by the 1965 Watts riots, asking himself how he could keep recording love songs while the world around him seemed to be exploding.
What's happening? What's happening?
But it was specifically his brother's first-hand account of Vietnam, combined with the broader unrest of the era, that gave Gaye the emotional and narrative architecture for what would become his masterpiece.
What's happening, brother?
What's Going On, released in 1971, is structured as a concept album told from the perspective of a Vietnam veteran returning home to find a country fractured by racism, poverty, and injustice. A country that doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand what he's just been through.
I want to know what's in. Woo! What's
The second track on the album, What's Happening, Brother, is explicitly dedicated to and inspired by Frankie, with lyrics directly addressing the disorientation of a veteran trying to find work, find his place, find any kind of normal life after combat.
what's happening? I want to
Berry Gordy famously called the original demo the worst thing I have ever heard in my life and refused to release it for months until Marvin Gaye effectively went on strike, refusing to record anything else until Motown relented.
still getting down where we used to go and dance.
When it finally was released, What's Going On became one of the most critically acclaimed albums in American music history. Rolling Stone has repeatedly ranked it the greatest album ever made.
Been gone a long, long time.
And at the emotional center of that achievement is a brother's draft notice, 3 years of letters from a war zone, and the kind of grief that only comes from watching someone you love come home changed.
What's happening, brother? What's happening?
Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, Edwin Starr, War, 1970. Here's where the story Motown wouldn't tell with the Temptations finally got told. Edwin Starr, born Charles Hatcher, had a complicated relationship with the military himself. Sources differ on whether he was drafted or enlisted around 1960,
To innocent life, won't be tears.
but he served roughly 3 years in the U.S. Army, stationed in Europe before returning to civilian life and rebuilding a music career from scratch in Cleveland and then Detroit.
What is it good for? Nothing said.
By 1970, Starr had become a Motown artist almost by accident. His previous label, Rick Tick, had been bought out by Berry Gordy, absorbing Starr's contract into the Motown system.
All right.
He was considered, in his own words and in the words of music historians since, one of Motown's second string acts. His only major hit to that point had been 25 Miles in 1969.
Well.
He had relatively little to lose, and crucially, none of the carefully protected mainstream crossover image that made Motown executives so nervous about the Temptations.
The sons go off to fight and lose their life.
When Starr heard about the internal conflict surrounding war, that Motown had a finished, powerful anti-war record sitting on a shelf because it was deemed too risky for their biggest group, he volunteered to record his own version.
To die. Yeah.
Producer Norman Whitfield completely reworked the arrangement around Starr's raw James Brown-influenced vocal style, adding prominent guitar, clavinet, a heavily syncopated horn-driven rhythm, and Starr's own improvised, shouted ad-libs throughout.
What is it good for? Well.
The result was an entirely different animal from the Temptations' more restrained album cut. Dramatic, intense, furious, Released as a single in June 1970, War hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on August 29, 1970, and stayed there for 3 consecutive weeks. It became, and remains, one of the most successful and recognizable protest songs in American music history, chanted at anti-war rallies for decades afterward, later covered by Bruce Springsteen, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and dozens of other artists. A song born from one group's military-related caution became the signature hit of a singer with his own complicated, partially documented military past. A proof that the song the draft-era public most desperately needed to hear almost never got released at all. Number 7. The Temptations, War, 1970. In 1969, Motown's most consistently bankable group, The Temptations, recorded a song called War, written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong.
The mother's eyes when the sons go off the pipe and look.
The same songwriting team behind I Heard It Through the Grapevine, it was a direct, blunt, anti-Vietnam War statement built around a chant-like chorus. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. The track appeared on the group's 1970 album Psychedelic Shack, with Paul Williams and Dennis Edwards delivering lead vocals over a stripped-down arrangement, bass singer Melvin Franklin chanting military-style cadence counts in the background.
Say it again.
The album track generated real interest, especially among college students and young people caught up in the growing anti-war movement, many of whom were themselves facing the draft or watching friends get drafted. Letters poured into Motown's offices, by some accounts more than 4,000 of them, specifically requesting that War be released as a single. But Berry Gordy and Motown's leadership got nervous.
Wars have shattered many young men's dreams.
The Temptations were one of the label's biggest and most consistently profitable acts, with crossover appeal across both black and white audiences.
Absolutely nothing. Good God.
Motown's executives worried that attaching something this directly, explicitly political to the group's image could alienate more conservative listeners and damage years of carefully built commercial momentum.
Yeah. It's nothing but a heartbreak.
So despite the overwhelming public demand, Motown made the decision to withhold the Temptations' own recording of War from single release entirely.
They say we must fight.
It's a story about caution colliding directly with a war that, by 1970, had already been raging for the better part of a decade and had drafted millions of young Americans, including substantial numbers of young black men from exactly the communities the Temptations represented on stage every night. The label that had built its identity on the sound of young America got cold feet the moment that sound was asked to say something uncomfortable and direct about young America's most urgent and divisive crisis. The song the Temptations recorded first and were never allowed to release as their own statement ended up becoming one of the most successful protest records in American history, just not in their hands.
Friend only to the undertaker.
Number 6, Bill Withers, Ain't No Sunshine, 1971.
Warm when she's away.
Bill Withers' story with the military doesn't begin with the draft. It begins 9 years earlier with a choice. At 17 years old, growing up in the coal mining country of Slab Fork, West Virginia, where his father had died when Withers was just 13, Withers enlisted in the United States Navy as a way out of poverty. He served for 9 full years, working as an aviation mechanic, and it was during his time in the Navy that he first became seriously interested in singing and songwriting, even as he battled and eventually overcame a childhood stutter. By the time Withers left the Navy in 1965, he was 27 years old. Most pop and soul stars of the era were breaking through in their late teens or early 20s. Withers had spent nearly a decade of what would otherwise have been his prime career-building years in military service instead, including service that overlapped directly with the escalation of the Vietnam War, even though his specific postings kept him out of direct combat. He moved to Los Angeles in 1967 to try to start a music career, but he didn't have the financial luxury of betting everything on it immediately. He worked a day job as a mechanical assembler, first for Douglas Aircraft, later for other manufacturers, recording demos with his own money on his own time, shopping them around at night, refusing to quit his day job even after early signs of interest, because he simply did not trust the music industry to provide stability. When she's gone. It wasn't until 1971, at 32 years old, nearly a decade and a half after he'd first enlisted to escape poverty, that Bill Withers released his debut album, Just As I Am, featuring Ain't No Sunshine and Grandma's Hands. The album cover itself shows Withers standing at his day job at an aircraft manufacturing plant, holding his lunchbox, a deliberate statement about exactly how long and how hard the road had been. He famously received 2 letters on the same day in October 1971, one offering to rehire him at his old mechanic's job and one inviting him to perform on The Tonight Show. He chose music, but it had taken 9 years of military service and years more of manual labor to even get the chance to choose. Ain't no sunshine. Number 5, Gene Chandler, Duke of Earl. Gene Chandler's military story predates Vietnam specifically. He was drafted into the United States Army in 1957 and served in Germany until 1960, during the Cold War buildup rather than the Vietnam conflict itself. But his story belongs in this larger conversation because it shows exactly how the broader era of American military conscription, the system that would later funnel millions of young men into Vietnam, was already reshaping soul music careers years before Vietnam became a household word. Before his military service, Chandler, then performing under his birth name Eugene Dixon, had already formed a vocal group called the Duquesnes in Chicago in 1957, quickly becoming their lead singer. Then came the draft notice. Chandler left the group, left Chicago, and left music entirely for 3 years to serve his country in Germany. When he returned to Chicago in 1960, honorably discharged, he immediately rejoined the Duquesnes, picking up almost exactly where he'd left off 3 years earlier, as though no time had passed at all. You are my Duchess. The group signed with Nat Records, and in 1961, working with producers Carl Davis and Bill Bunky Shepherd, they recorded a song called Duke of Earl. Released in 1962 under Chandler's now adopted stage name, inspired by the song's regal persona, Duke of Earl became a massive #1 hit, one of the defining doo-wop into soul crossover records of the early 1960s, and it gave Chandler the nickname that would define the rest of his 6-decade career. What makes Chandler's story so important to this broader narrative is the timing. He represents the generation of R&B and soul artists who came up immediately before Vietnam, who were drafted under the same selective service system that would later send so many of their younger peers and label mates to Southeast Asia. His 3 years of lost momentum, the group he had to leave behind and then successfully rebuild, previewed almost exactly what would happen to dozens of younger artists just a few years later, once the draft call started specifically targeting Vietnam deployment instead of peacetime service in Europe. Number 4, the Chi-Lites, For God's Sake, Give More Power to the People, 1971. The Chi-Lites, out of Chicago, are best remembered today for tender, romantic ballads like Oh Girl and Have You Seen Her? Smooth, falsetto-driven love songs that became signature sounds of early 1970s soul radio.
How can you think of love you don't have?
But buried within their catalog is a far more pointed and politically charged record that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Released at the absolute height of American anxiety about Vietnam.
Time to care.
In July 1971, the group, led by songwriter and lead vocalist Eugene Record, released their third album titled, For God's Sake, Give More Power to the People.
For God's sake, why don't you give more power to?
The album was explicitly socially conscious, addressing poverty, inequality, and the broader unrest gripping the country, recorded during the same general period that Marvin Gaye was working on What's Going On, and Edwin Starr was recording War.
And you're right back where you were.
As Motown and other major soul labels increasingly grappled with how to respond to a war that had been raging with no end in sight since the mid-1960s.
Power to the people.
The title track became a top 10 R&B hit, and its message resonated specifically with listeners who understood that the war and the draft were inseparable from the broader struggles facing black communities in America.
God save.
You got to give more power to the people.
Economic struggles, political struggles, struggles for basic recognition and representation articulated by a vocal group that, on the surface, listeners associated mostly with love songs.
For God's sake.
Why don't you give more power?
This is what makes the Chi-Lites' contribution to the Vietnam-era soul story so important. They proved that even an act built primarily on romance and harmony could pivot, when the moment demanded it, to direct social commentary that connected with an audience living through the daily reality of friends, brothers, and neighbors being drafted and sent overseas.
You got to give more power to the people.
Eugene Record, in particular, used his songwriting platform at the Chi-Lites to insist that the war could not be separated from the broader fight for racial and economic justice happening simultaneously on American streets.
For God's sake.
Why don't you give more power to
A connection that Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye, and others were making at almost exactly the same moment independently across different cities, different labels, and different sounds, all converging on the same urgent truth.
For God's sake.
Number 3, Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, We're a Winner, 1967.
No more tears do we cry, and we have finally dried up.
Curtis Mayfield never went to Vietnam. He wasn't drafted. But almost nobody in American popular music turned the draft, the war, and the social fractures it caused into more direct, more urgent musical commentary than Mayfield did throughout the late 1960s. And that itself is a story worth telling.
Like your leaders tell you to.
By 1967, with the war escalating and the draft pulling in record numbers of young black men disproportionately from poor and working class neighborhoods, Mayfield and the Impressions released We're a Winner, a song built explicitly around themes of black pride and resilience during a period when many of those listening to the song on the radio were also receiving draft notices in the mail.
We're moving on up. Moving on.
The song was banned by several radio stations specifically because of its political content, with some programmers viewing its message of black self-determination as too provocative for the moment.
Moving on up. Woo, we just keep on pushing.
Mayfield understood something that a lot of his contemporaries hadn't fully reckoned with yet, that the Vietnam draft was hitting black communities harder statistically than white communities due to systemic inequities in deferment access. Wealthier and more educated young men could often secure college deferments that working-class men, disproportionately black, frequently could not. Mayfield's music increasingly reflected an awareness of that injustice, running parallel to and often ahead of similar themes that Marvin Gaye, Edwin Starr, and others would explore a few years later.
I don't mind leaving here.
His earlier song, People Get Ready, from 1965, had already become an anthem of the civil rights movement. But as the decade progressed and the war consumed more and more young black men, Mayfield's lyrics grew sharper and more pointed about systemic injustice at home colliding with systemic injustice abroad.
Like your leaders tell you to.
By the time of his 1970 solo album Curtis, released after he left the Impressions, songs like We the People Who Are Darker Than Blue extended that same thread, connecting the war, the draft, and racial inequality into one continuous indictment.
You're a winner.
Mayfield's contribution to this story isn't about personal military service. It's about an artist who watched his community get drafted at disproportionate rates and used every available platform to say so, years before it became a mainstream protest movement talking point.
All right. Now everybody say, hey.
He built the moral and musical vocabulary that other Vietnam-era soul records would later draw from directly.
Just a little bit louder now. Amen.
Number 2, the Delfonics, La La Means I Love You, 1968. Before the Delfonics became one of the defining sounds of Philadelphia soul, they were a much smaller, much rougher group called the Orphonics, formed around 1964 by two brothers, William and Wilbert Hart, along with their friends Randy Kane and Richie Daniels.
And though you're in the center rain and the
4 guys from Philadelphia singing on street corners and at talent shows, trying to find a sound. And then Richie Daniels was drafted.
now I don't wear a diamond ring.
He joined the armed services, and just like that, 1/4 of the group's original lineup was gone. Not through a falling out, not through creative differences, but through a letter from the selective service system that every young man of that era lived in fear of receiving.
To sing all the way.
The remaining members had to regroup. They brought in a replacement, Ricky Johnson, to fill the gap left by Daniels' departure. And eventually, Randy Kane rejoined after some lineup shuffling, solidifying what would become the classic trio of William Hart, Wilbert Hart, and Randy Kane.
And if I ever saw a girl I needed.
It was this lineup, the one rebuilt in the aftermath of a member's military service, that caught the attention of producer Tom Bell and manager Stan Watson in 1965 and 1966.
Listen to me.
By December 1967, this reconstituted version of the group recorded a song called La La Means I Love You, written by William Hart and inspired, according to group lore, by the babbling of Hart's young son. Released in 1968 on the newly formed Philly Groove label, it became a massive hit, reaching number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, selling over 1 million copies and earning a gold record. It It's now considered one of the founding texts of what would become known as the Philadelphia soul sound, the lush, falsetto-driven style that would define an entire era of black music. Richie Daniels never got to be part of that triumph. The group that broke through commercially in 1968 was fundamentally not the group he had helped build just a few years earlier. He was somewhere else entirely, serving his country, while the sound he had helped shape from the very beginning went on to become a gold record without him. It's one of the quietest, least discussed draft casualties in soul music history. A founding member written out of the story almost entirely, simply because his number came up before the hits did. Number 1. The Archie Bell Story. Continued. The Drells, A Soldier's Prayer, 1967. We close where this story is at its most complete, back with Archie Bell and the Drells, because their catalog contains not just the most dramatic individual draft story in soul music, but also one of the most emotionally honest pieces of draft-era songwriting most listeners have never heard.
Remember my love for you.
Before Tighten Up made them famous, and around the same period that Archie Bell himself was facing his own draft notice, the group recorded a song called A Soldier's Prayer 1967 for a small Houston label. Unlike the more overtly political anti-war anthems that would come later from Edwin Starr or The Temptations, A Soldier's Prayer 1967 took a different, quieter, more personal angle. The perspective of a young man who has just received his draft card and who is not making a grand political statement against the war, but simply, plainly, honestly admitting his fear.
Oh, when this cruel.
The narrator pleads, almost childlike in his vulnerability, "Please, Uncle Sam, I really don't want to go," and in a spoken word verse expresses regret that he didn't marry his girlfriend before leaving for Vietnam.
But whatever the outcome may be,
this is the sound of draft-era soul music at its rawest and most human. Not a protest anthem designed for a rally, but a private confession of fear set to music, recorded by a group whose own lead singer would, within months, be living out exactly the experience the song describes.
in bed, I'll be coming home to you.
Archie Bell wasn't performing someone else's anxiety. He was about to become the embodiment of it. He went on to be drafted, sent to Vietnam, and wounded in combat, all while his earlier recording of Tighten Up sat waiting to become the biggest hit of his career.
Oh, when this cruel.
That's the full arc of what the Vietnam draft did to R&B music between 1965 and 1973. It took members out of vocal groups before they ever got the chance to share in the success they helped build. It made record labels too scared to release the truth in their biggest stars' own voices. It turned A Soldier's Letters Home into the greatest album ever recorded. And in at least one case, it sent a man to war. While his own song about the fear of being sent to war was already on the radio, and his biggest hit of all was about to climb to number one while he recovered from his wounds. 10 different stories, one war, one draft, and a body of music that still carries all of it.
You got what you mean?
10 stories, one war that touched every single one of them directly or through the people they loved. Some came home changed and turned that change into the greatest album ever made. Some never got the chance to share in the success they helped build. Some had labels too afraid to let them speak and had to watch someone else say it for them. The Vietnam draft didn't just take young men away from their families. For an entire generation of R&B and soul artists, It took them away from their own music, their own bands, and sometimes their own stories.